The lecture hall was silent, deathly silent. Just moments ago, the air had been filled with arrogant laughter. Professor Nathaniel Carter, a man revered for his sharp wit and brutal takedowns, had just delivered what he believed was his most devastating argument yet, a condescending monologue ridiculing faith, dismissing God as nothing more than a fairy tale for the weak-minded. But now the room felt different. Standing in the midst of the stunned audience was a single student who had not backed down. Barron Trump. The professor's smirk wavered ever so slightly. He had expected the usual reaction, a flustered retreat, nervous stammering, or a desperate attempt at rebuttal that he could easily dismantle. But this time was different. Barron did not flinch. Instead, he met Carter's gaze head-on, his posture unshaken, his hands resting firmly at his sides. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, dangerously calm. Professor, for someone who claims to be devoted to reason and logic, you seem surprisingly comfortable making baseless assumptions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. A hush fell over the students. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had chuckled at Carter's mockery now sensed something was off. Barron wasn't just another student fumbling through an argument, he was a challenger. And the professor had just made a mistake. A mistake that would leave him speechless. What will Barron say? How will this debate unfold? The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Professor Carter leaned against the podium, his smirk returning, though this time it seemed more forced. He removed his glasses, twirling them between his fingers as he eyed Barron like a predator sizing up its prey. "Ah," he exhaled, the condescension dripping from his voice. "And here I thought we were going to have an intellectual discussion, but I see we are venturing into faith-based fairy tales." A few students chuckled nervously, but others remained silent, waiting, watching. Barron didn't react to the insult. He remained still, steady, unshaken. "You seem confident," Barron said, his tone unreadable. "Tell me, Professor, is it intelligence or arrogance that makes you dismiss entire worldviews without debate?" Professor Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "Debate? Oh, my dear boy, faith is not up for debate. It is the absence of reason, not the product of it. Science has long buried the myths of the past, the idea of a divine creator. It belongs in a museum next to Greek mythology and Norse gods." His voice carried the same authority that had silenced so many before. But this time it was different. Barron wasn't silenced. Instead, he stepped forward. The room, once filled with the professor's voice, now seemed to belong to Barron. "You speak of science burying faith," he said, his voice even. "And yet some of the greatest scientific minds, Newton, Einstein, Max Planck, acknowledged that there was something greater than what we see. They understood that science and faith were not enemies, but allies." The smirk on Carter's face faded slightly. A murmur spread through the audience. Professor Henry Wallace, a senior faculty member sitting in the back of the hall, narrowed his eyes. He had seen Carter dominate these intellectual battles countless times before, but something was different today. Barron wasn't nervous, he wasn't rambling, he wasn't retreating, he was pushing back. And Carter could feel it. Still the professor scoffed, shaking his head. "Ah, yes, the classic appeal to authority argument. Just because some scientists had religious beliefs does not make them correct. What matters is evidence. And tell me, Mr. Trump, where is your evidence for an invisible sky deity?" More chuckles from a few students. Carter straightened, feeling the balance of power return to his side. But Barron... He smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. and for the first time, Professor Carter felt uneasy. "The real question isn't whether or not there is evidence," Barron said, his voice sharp, "but whether you are willing to accept it. Because if we are talking about faith, Professor, I would argue that it takes a far greater leap of faith to believe that everything in the universe, consciousness, morality, purpose, came from nothing than to believe that it came from something." The room fell silent. Professor Carter's expression flickered. For the first time in years, he didn't have an immediate response. The battle had begun, and for the first time, the professor wasn't sure he would win. The air in the lecture hall grew heavier, charged with an energy that neither the professor nor the students had expected. For years, Professor Carter had dominated this arena, reducing faith to dust beneath the weight of his rhetoric. But today was different. Barron Trump wasn't backing down. He wasn't scrambling for words. He was standing his ground. Carter adjusted his glasses and exhaled through his nose, masking his irritation with a forced chuckle. "Ah, the fine-tuned universe argument," he said, shaking his head. "Tell me, Mr. Trump, do you believe that because the universe appears designed, it must have a designer? That's a primitive way of thinking, akin to ancient tribes believing thunder was the anger of the gods." The class chuckled, but it was weaker this time. Barron remained still. "No," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "I believe that dismissing something as primitive simply because it challenges your worldview is not intellectual rigor, it's arrogance." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Professor Carter's jaw tensed ever so slightly. "Let's test that theory then," he said, stepping away from the podium. "You claim there is evidence for God. Very well, present it. But do remember, this is an academic setting. If your argument relies on feelings or subjective experiences, you will embarrass yourself." Barron didn't hesitate. "Fair enough," he said. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the screen behind Carter, where the professor's graph from earlier was still displayed. "You presented a chart that claims religious belief declines as intelligence rises," Barron continued. "But correlation does not equal causation, Professor. You, of all people, should know that." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning the validity of decades of research?" he asked, folding his arms. "No," Barron replied. "I'm questioning how you are interpreting it." A murmur rippled through the class. Professor Wallace in the back leaned forward, intrigued. Barron took a slow step forward. "You argue that as IQ increases, religious belief decreases, implying that faith is a sign of intellectual inferiority," he said. "Yet you conveniently ignore the fact that some of history's greatest scientific minds, Newton, Maxwell, Planck, Pasteur, held strong religious convictions." Carter scoffed. "Cherry-picking examples does not prove anything, Mr. Trump." "Neither does cherry-picking data," Barron countered. Carter's fingers twitched. The room was watching, waiting. "Consider this," Barron continued. "What if the decline in religious belief among academics is not a reflection of intelligence, but rather a reflection of intellectual culture?" Carter frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that academia has fostered an environment where faith is ridiculed rather than debated," Barron said. "That belief in God is dismissed not because it lacks reason, but because it is inconvenient to an ideology that prides itself on human self-sufficiency." The words hit their mark. A few students shifted in their seats. Others stole glances at Carter, waiting for his retort. The professor stiffened. "That's an emotional argument, not a rational one," he said dismissively. "Academia challenges outdated beliefs because progress demands it." "Progress," Barron repeated, nodding. And yet tell me, Professor, has human progress eliminated the fundamental questions of existence? Where do we come from? Why does the universe operate on such precise mathematical laws? Why does consciousness exist at all? Carter waved a hand. These are gaps in our current understanding. Science will eventually answer them. Perhaps, Barron said, but notice what you just did. You placed faith in science's ability to answer questions it has not yet answered. That is not scientific certainty, Professor. That is a belief in the unseen. Silence. Carter's expression hardened. His grip on his glasses tightened. The students were no longer chuckling. They were listening. And for the first time, Carter felt something he hadn't in years. Doubt. Barron took another step forward, his eyes unwavering. You claim that faith is irrational, he said. But tell me, Professor, what is more irrational? To believe that an intelligent mind designed the universe, or to believe that nothing exploded into everything by accident, with laws so precise that even a fraction of a change would render life impossible? The professor's lips parted slightly. He had faced hundreds of students before, but none like this. Barron was not merely debating. He was turning Carter's methods against him, and it was working. Carter inhaled sharply, regaining his composure. You are misrepresenting the scientific consensus, he said. Evolution, cosmology, neuroscience, all of these fields have provided rational explanations for the phenomena you attribute to the divine. And yet, Barron said, none of them can answer the ultimate why. He paused, letting the words settle. Why does something exist rather than nothing? Why does morality exist beyond survival instincts? Why does the universe, unlike an explosion, produce order instead of chaos? Carter's jaw tightened. His heart pounded against his ribs. He had an answer. He always had an answer, but not this time, not to this. The realization hit him like a wave. He was on the defensive. For the first time in his career, the power was shifting. The once smug professor was losing control, and everyone in that room could see it. The tension in the room had reached its peak. For years, Professor Carter had dominated these discussions with his sharp intellect and cutting sarcasm. He had made a career of dismantling faith with ruthless efficiency, reducing belief to a relic of the past. But now he was cornered. Barron Trump stood before him, not angry, not flustered, not desperate, calm, composed, unshaken. The professor clenched his jaw, adjusting his stance. His usual confidence felt brittle, cracking under the weight of Barron's relentless logic. You're making a classic argument from ignorance, Carter said, forcing a smirk. Just because we don't have all the answers yet does not mean God is the answer. That's nothing more than a God of the gaps fallacy. A few students nodded. Carter grasped onto that moment, trying to regain control. But Barron was ready. That would be true, Barron said, if I was simply plugging God into what we don't know, but I'm not. I'm pointing out that your worldview has gaps too, gaps you refuse to acknowledge. Carter blinked. Barron stepped closer. You claim faith is blind, he continued, yet you place your faith in something equally unproven, that life, morality, consciousness arose from randomness with no intentional cause. You say I believe in God because I want meaning, but tell me, Professor, do you reject God because you don't want there to be meaning? Carter stiffened. The words struck deeper than expected. That's absurd, he said, though his voice was quieter now. Is it? Barron pressed. If God is real, then so is moral accountability, purpose, a truth greater than ourselves. You have spent your career convincing people that faith is foolish. Perhaps because the alternative terrifies you. Carter's fingers curled into fists. He wanted to fire back. He wanted to win. But Barron's words had settled into something deeper, something uncomfortable. The professor had no rebuttal. The room was completely still. Students who had once laughed along with Carter's mockery now sat frozen, watching as their once invincible professor struggled for words. Carter's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His mind raced. There had to be a counter-argument. There was always a counter-argument. But not today, because today he had finally been challenged. Barron didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply stepped back. The fight was over. And everyone knew it. Carter's gaze flickered toward the back of the room, where Professor Wallace sat watching. The older man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. He had known this day would come. Carter swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He had spent years tearing apart the beliefs of others. But today, his certainty had been shaken. He forced himself to look at Barron. The young man's expression remained unreadable, serene, confident, yet never arrogant. That was what disturbed Carter the most. He had expected anger. He had expected emotion. But Barron had never needed them. He had let the truth speak for itself. And now, standing in front of a man who had spent his life tearing down faith, Barron had done the unthinkable. He had left him speechless. The silence in the lecture hall was deafening. Professor Carter stood motionless at the podium, his face pale, his usual air of confidence stripped away. The weight of Barron's words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him like an unbearable force. He had spent years challenging students, dismantling their beliefs, reducing faith to nothing more than an outdated superstition. But today, he had no answer. The students who had once laughed at Carter's jokes, who had found entertainment in his sarcastic takedowns, now sat in stunned silence. Some glanced at Barron, others exchanged uneasy looks. And then a slow, deliberate sound broke the silence. Clap, clap. Professor Henry Wallace, seated at the back of the room, leaned forward, his hands coming together in a measured applause. The sound echoed through the hall, crisp and deliberate. A few students followed hesitantly, unsure of what to do. But within seconds, the trickle turned into a wave. Applause swept through the room. Not for Carter, for Barron. For the first time in his career, Carter was not the one who had won the intellectual battle. For the first time, he was not the one being praised. His chest tightened. His grip on the podium felt weak. His entire worldview, his entire career, had been built on the certainty that faith was foolish. And yet here he stood, exposed. He had not defeated Barron. Barron had defeated him, not through mockery, not through arrogance, but through truth. Carter swallowed hard. He turned to the screen behind him as if looking for anything to regain control of the room, but the graphs and charts that had once been his weapons now felt meaningless. Numbers, statistics, cold, sterile facts. And yet, none of them had been able to answer the most fundamental question of all. Why? He looked back at Barron. The young man had already returned to his seat, unbothered by the victory. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't basking in the moment. He had made his point, and that was enough. Carter exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "We'll continue next time," he muttered, barely able to find his voice. The students began gathering their things. The usual rush of conversation and movement filled the room, but something was different. No one was talking about the lecture. No one was repeating Carter's arguments. Instead, they were whispering about Barron, his composure, his logic, his unshakable belief. Carter slumped into his chair as the students filed out. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes drifted across the emptying room until they landed on Professor Wallace, who had not left his seat. The older man studied him for a long moment, then finally stood, tucking his hands into his pockets. "Nathaniel," Wallace said, his voice even, "I warned you this would happen one day." Carter didn't respond. He wasn't sure he could. Wallace sighed and shook his head. "You've spent your career tearing down faith," he said. "But tell me, have you ever once stopped to wonder if you're the one who's been wrong all along?" Carter's breath caught in his throat. For the first time, the question lingered. For the first time, he wasn't sure of the answer. 1 week later, the video of the debate had spread across campus. Students debated fiercely in dorm rooms, in cafeterias, in hallways. Some tried to defend Carter's points. Others sided with Barron. But one thing was undeniable. Something had shifted. People were thinking, and that was the true victory. One evening, long after his last lecture, Carter sat alone in his office. His desk was cluttered with books and papers, evidence of a lifetime spent building his arguments, refining his rebuttals, and sharpening his attacks on faith. But tonight, none of it felt solid. Tonight, for the first time, he felt uncertain. His eyes flickered to the corner of his desk, where an old book lay beneath a pile of papers. A Bible, untouched for years. He hesitated. Then, slowly, cautiously, he reached for it. His fingers brushed against the worn cover, and for the first time in decades, he opened it. This was never just about a debate. It was about truth. About standing firm in what you believe, even when the world tries to tear it down. Because in the end, truth does not crumble under pressure. It only becomes stronger. And sometimes all it takes is one voice, one challenge, one moment of clarity to change everything. If this story made you think, challenged your perspective, or inspired you, do not let it stop here. Hit the like button to support more powerful, eye-opening content. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that dives deep into truth, courage, and the power of standing firm in your beliefs. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Let's start a conversation, challenge ideas, and seek the truth together. Because truth deserves to be heard. Subscribe now and join the movement.